you can either be sexier and therefore chosen by the opposite sex, or you can be more robust and be more likely to survive. A huge argument can be made for what's known as founder effects that give rise to a characteristic that becomes popular in a breeding pool and therefore then guides the evolution of characteristics that are not having survival effects, they're having reproduction effects. The whole thing is nothing other than an interesting thought experiment, but it is. But I think we can see now with our understanding about genes work where it goes. We want a society, a free enterprise society, where you get to waste your time and energy pursuing anything you want as long as you can feed yourself or somebody will feed you.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Beat Your Genes podcast. This is episode number 343, and in today's show, we have a fun discussion about how environment might shape individual differences. Now, we've had a similar topic like this in episode 299 before we went to video. So if you're wanting to hear Dr. Lisle's answer to that question, you can visit any podcasting app like Spotify, iTunes, or Libsyn, or you can find it directly on our podcast website, beatyourgenes.org. Also, in this episode, Dr. Lisle gave a very comprehensive answer for our first question, and then he wanted to take a second question, and I thought that it would be best to split those videos up, so part 2 will be coming shortly after this video releases. As always, if you have questions that you'd like me to ask Dr. Lisle on the show, you can email me or send in a question through our website. Thanks for watching as always, and we'll see you in the video. All right, Dr. Lisle, how are you doing today?
Good, Nathan. Good to see you as always.
Good to see you too. So we've got we had a lot of interesting, fun replies from the last show about LeBron James and Donnie James, which was fun.
Bronny.
Excuse me. See, this is my lack of fanhood in basketball showing. But I just saw the other day that they had their first game together, and of course, LeBron's out there celebrating because he dunked, made a dunk, and I started thinking, he's putting his kid in an ego trap potentially, but really he's just displaying to the females in the crowd, look how good my genes are,
Totally.
Yeah.
He's absolutely doing that. Look, nobody else has ever done it.
Mm-hmm.
There's never been a father-son in the NBA. Never happened. So now he gets to do one more first, and it's an interesting twist. It's not like, oh, I'm an old man and I'm still good. It's like, oh, look at my son. This is how good my genes are. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah. Now, if I'm not mistaken, was LeBron James one of the youngest players in the NBA? Like he came out right out of high school or something like that?
Straight out of high school. Yeah.
Okay.
So LeBron James was a freak. And LeBron James at 17 years old, when he was in high school, he was one of the best 10 players in the world. Mm-hmm. And everybody knew it because they had played summer leagues with this kid, and they knew that this guy, that's why he has tattooed on his arm, the chosen one. He was. And so he knew he was the second coming of Jordan. Wow. And it was obvious. I listened to his very first game. It was against the Sacramento Kings. Mm-hmm. And I still remember it. I can remember the odd respect of Gary Gerald, the Kings announcer for 50 years, saying, he wasn't just good. He was like the best player on the floor, and he was easy. He was, they got beat. The Kings were a great team back then. They were an NBA Finals level team. But this 17-year-old, maybe just barely turning 18, went out there and outplayed everybody, including Chris Webber, multiple times All-Star, now in the Hall of Fame, Vladdy Divac, everybody. It's like, oh no, that's the best basketball player on that floor tonight. First NBA game, 17 years, 8 months, or whatever the hell he was. He might have been 18. Maybe he had to be 18. I don't remember what the rules were. But the point is, he just graduated from high school.
Wow.
And so this guy was 1 in a billion. And his kid is 1 in 100,000.
Right. And
that's all right.
Yeah. Well, that's the kind of the interesting thing is because with evolutionary psychology, many people will sometimes think that you can just breed and just pass on the genes and pass on the genes. And so I was looking at the past episode where you talked about some of this in terms of intelligence. Mm-hmm. And so I'll play it here in a second. Dear doctors, I'm curious about an unpopular subject, systematic eugenics. Has random selection in the regular mating market already produced the best possible human genes combinations at some point in history? Or with the systematic program of human breeding, could we generate humans with drastically higher IQ, strength, size, speed, athleticism, beauty, etc.? What do you think is the hypothetical limit of human genetic potential for outlier individuals and for the average of a population? This kind of discussion is often obscured by the obvious practical and ethical problems involved in implementing such a program, rather than how well it might be able to work and what it could theoretically achieve.
Yeah, it's kind of a... go ahead.
Fortunately for everybody, it doesn't work very well. So you can't you can't actually do this. But yes, this is an interesting topic, and we'll let Doug dive in. But my top line sort of answer to this, anytime this comes up, is you humans are not Brussels sprouts. You can't engage in some sort of breeding program to select in this simplistic way for ideal genes that you might like to concentrate in the population and create a master race. It doesn't work, and that's probably a very fortunate thing for all involved. But it sounded like Doug was going to launch into this too.
Yeah, I don't know that much about it, except that in reading Blueprint, I learned some things that I didn't know. And interestingly enough, with that book written in about 2020, he was covering things that clearly Jeffrey Miller didn't know as a result of 2015. As of 2015, about that time, sometime in the last 10 years, Miller was writing about how the Chinese were doing essentially this. They had isolated a gene that was associated with very high IQs, and they were essentially probably aiming at some selective breeding programs to try to create a master brilliant race. It turns out it's going to fail. And the reason why is what Plomin and others have discovered is that traits of any significant thing that you're going to measure on are actually, they're being carried in tiny, tiny little variances where the typical gene is responsible for less than 1/100th of the variance, less than 1/100th of a percent.
Less than that.
Yeah, in other words, 1/10,000th of the variance is covered by a single gene, and so therefore there's going to be no way. So even if you found a single gene that happens to be sitting inside of your extremely high IQ people, that single gene is probably at most responsible for 1/4 of an IQ point. So it just happens to be carrying along with a whole bunch of suites of other genes, and those suites of other genes are randomly distributed all over hell's half acre. They're not all consistently sitting inside your high IQ people.
But that's what our question is about today. It's about intelligence and IQ and cooperation. And so I want to get your take on this, and then let's see what happens.
Right. Go ahead.
So, dear Dr. Lisle, you've often mentioned that we cannot get intelligent people to breed for generations and then give rise to a population whose average IQ is higher than the current average IQ. You've mentioned China, Singapore tried to experiment with this idea, but they failed. But Dr. Lisle, you've also said that today's human is on average much more cooperative than the ancient human. So if the average cooperation can be bred to a higher level, why cannot the average IQ be bred to a higher level?
Really good question. And I think that I could see where there would be misunderstandings of things that I've said. You could, in principle, breed smarter and smarter human. You'd have to kill off everybody that's, in the bottom 80 percentile. And we start with the top 80 percentile. Those people breed. Then the ones that are at the bottom half of the children that are on the bottom half, we kill those. And then we just maintain the ones that are at the upper half. And then we breed those, and then we kill those that are on the bottom half of that distribution. And if we do that, that's how you get a French poodle. That's how you get a French poodle out of an Arctic wolf. Okay. So it's going to take you 4,000 generations, but you will eventually get there. Okay. And so you could do this with humans, and humans are quite a bit different as they selected for different characteristics, both sexually and through environmental force. In other words, there's two different paths towards evolution in a sexually reproducing organism, an animal specifically, and that is that you can either be sexier and therefore chosen by the opposite sex, or you can be more robust and be more likely to survive. So the second is what we call natural selection, which is what Darwin focused on. Sexual selection was that you could have something that would be costly for your ability to survive, but it would improve your ability to reproduce. And therefore, if that happened, that could and would evolve if the statistical advantages to reproduction were great enough to make up for the differences in survival. So I would have been happy to have much sexier characteristics in this life, and I would have traded 10 years for it. Okay. And many people have, i.e., a very handsome testosteronized race car driver has done exactly that. That guy dies in the car at 27, but that guy had more fancy partners than I would have had in 3 lifetimes. Okay. So sexual selection is a very real and very potent force in evolution. Now, so let's suppose and evolution in principle could select on anything. It could select on big noses, high eyebrows, big rear ends, small rear ends, big hands, little hands, big penises, small penises, twisted up penises, whatever. There's no end. Evolution could select on anything that happens to be either really useful for survival or really useful for reproduction. So it's going to turn out that survival advantages are hard to come by, and they're really subtle because not too many organisms die before they reproduce if they're a slow-growing, big fancy organism like a human. Now, if you're a bacteria, that's different. If you're turtles, that's different. In other words, almost all turtles die and eagles get them all, but 1 in 3,000 actually gets to the ocean and freaking survives. Okay. So those things actually have what's known as a lot of selection pressure on their survival. Human beings don't have a lot of selection pressure on their survival. They live in well-defended groups. The vast majority of them are going to live till, if they make it to the 10, if they're not stupid enough or unlucky enough to get picked off by a predator when they're young, they're probably going to live 40 or 50 years and they'll live to reproduce. So therefore, there's not a lot of selection pressure on human survival. We can see evidence of selection pressure on human survival by looking at, for example, skin tone in people, body morphological characteristics around the globe. We see that we are not the same. We don't look the same as the modern Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, which is where you came from. Okay, so 100,000 years ago, all of our ancestors looked like the Bushmen of the Kalahari. Today, we don't. Okay, why? Because we moved into different habitats, and it turned out that over massive amounts of 5,000 generations in the last 100,000 years, 5,000 generations, you can go from an Arctic wolf to a poodle, and in 5,000 generations, you can go from a Bushman to me. Okay, so you go far enough, long enough in evolution, you change the habitat for long enough, and little by little by little by little, you'll get physical characteristic differences, and you'll also get psychological characteristic differences as well. Now, but these are picking up on tiny little variances. They're slightly beneficial. It takes a long time for anything to shift and change. Okay, you can actually see the difference in the facial structure of someone who lives in middle Russia right now and a person that lives in Ireland. You can tell the difference. You can actually see the facial configuration difference. For some reason, those populations, which were probably 10,000 or 15,000 years apart in evolution, you can actually see morphological characteristic differences. So for some reason, it looked better to have curly hair and more rounded features in Ireland. We have no idea. They had more beer, and I don't know. It looks better when it goes down your gullet. I have no idea why the hell people look the way they do. But
does this also have to do with like darker skin for sun protection?
No question.
Well? Okay.
Oh, no question. So if you're around the equator, it's interesting that the the Inuit are, I think, darker skinned. I think that's probably to, I don't know, defend themselves in some way from reflecting. I actually don't understand that, but it makes basically though, when you go north, generally speaking, you get lighter skinned. You're needing to have less defense against solar radiation in order to synthesize vitamin D. So if you're at the equator, you need to defend yourself against solar radiation as much as you can. And obviously your needs for D are met much more easily because you got massively more sunlight. So this caused the differences in the amount of coloring there is in people's skin. The Anyway, but the point is that survival advantages move evolution very, very slowly. Okay, occasionally in a catastrophe they don't. Like, somehow you could have a characteristic that is highly disadvantageous and you get wiped out. So sharks were in the water when the big meteor hit, 80 million years ago or whenever the hell it was, and they're still around because they made it. So did the crocodiles, but the big dinosaurs didn't survive. They were on land. So occasionally that happens, but usually what happens is survival advantages of one type over, one style over another style. Longer nose, longer tail, shorter tail, bigger muscles, smaller muscles, longer legs, shorter legs. All of those things are usually extremely subtle, and evolution very, very, very slowly morphs an organism. It would never morph an organism as fast as an Arctic wolf to a poodle in whatever that is, 4,000 generations. It would not move that fast because that's artificial selection by humans picking for specific characteristics. So human beings have gotten smarter than they were a couple 100,000 years ago, in all probability. They have gotten nicer. We can tell by in the last 50 to 100,000 years, the skeletons are not as thick. So they're cooperating more often rather than bashing each over their head and taking the other guy's stuff. So this has taken place. So the question is, okay, well, give me 1,000 generations. Will we wind up with a smarter people? Very possibly not. In other words, there'd be no reason to believe that right now everybody's surviving, so there's no huge advantage to it's the smart people, and the development of capital has led so that the really stupid people can still live have a super high probability of surviving long enough to reproduce, and they're just as effective at reproducing as the smart people. So therefore, there is currently no evolutionary selection pressure that is being put on brains being selected for. Question is, could you artificially do it? And if you did artificially do it, would it succeed? And the answer is yes, it would succeed. But Geoffrey Miller was very afraid in 1910 or 2012 or so that the Chinese had identified genes that were associated with very, very super high IQs. And they thought, well, with a top-down communistic government, they can superimpose this. And basically those genes those guys can jerk off in bottles all day long. That can be their job. You know what I mean? And then we can see where we can find those genes in the females. And then we can just make those females be inseminated by that sperm. And then we can have a super race. Okay. That wasn't stupid at the time, but we didn't understand enough about genetics and the way genetics worked by that time. We might have, but Geoffrey Miller didn't know it. And I sure as hell didn't know it. Okay, I learned when Robert Plomin wrote Blueprint that in fact the contribution to what we call the phenotype or the outcome in an animal of a specific gene is very small. Now we're used to seeing that sometimes a single gene can have phenomenal consequences, like if you have Huntington's or not. So in other words, we've seen, wow, sometimes one gene makes a hell of a difference. But it turns out that is almost never true, and it's absolutely untrue with respect to intelligence. So even though you may find a single gene that is, highly a marker of very, very high IQ, it's going to turn out that gene specifically will have a tiny contribution to that IQ, about on the order of 1/10 of 1% of the variance. It's unbelievably small. So in other words, the way genes work, they don't work like a jigsaw puzzle that has 10 pieces in it and you put the 10 pieces together. They're a jigsaw puzzle that has 10,000 pieces. And it's like, oh, God, okay. And then it's not even that simple.
Yeah.
They work in combination.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it's like, oh, I've got the really good gene. Okay. Oh, but I don't have the really good gene. But is that a good combination or a bad combination? Well, it depends on the third gene. Oh, and then that one depends on the fourth gene. It's unbelievably interdependent. So this is why you won't see, for example, behavioral characteristics. If you got a mom and a dad and you share half of your genes with each of them, you're going to find that your psychology and your personality and even your looks is quite a bit different than they are. So it's you correlate with your parents like 0.2, which means that's unbelievably low. And so you would think, gosh, why don't I correlate 0.5? Sometimes you do. You'll see characteristics in yourself. Individual suites of characteristics will be extremely similar. So I could see that my dad and my mathematical abilities were very much a shadow and echo. We were extremely similar. I was actually a little bit faster than him, but he was just as good, in other words, at working through complicated math problems. He was a math teacher. And so we were able to see that we were both really similar. We could also tell that I was better than my sister. Okay. It's like, no, I'm a chunk better than my sister. My sister was definitely more gifted when it came to language. There wasn't any doubt about it. And she was better than both of us. So we can see pieces of the genes all over the place. My dad had outstanding upper body strength. I don't. My dad had great speed. I don't. My dad was not very well coordinated. I am. It's like, it's all freaking piecemeal all over the place. And so this is why you're not going to be able to quote breed for intelligence. You can't do it. It's too many little moving pieces. The correlations between parent and offspring are low. They are two siblings to show how low the correlation coefficient is and what this means. The variance in the population normally between two random members of the population is 17 IQ points. The variation between siblings on average is 13. So the shared genes they have narrows the variation, but it doesn't narrow it nearly as much as you think. Your intuition is that two siblings would be within 5 or 7 IQ points of each other. Mm-hmm. The fact when I found out that they were 13, I actually my ex-wife, in the last century, was very bright. Her sister, not so much. And I remember thinking, that's a weird family. Okay. And that's because my sister and I were similar. And it's like, no, in subsequent years, I found out all over the place. Oh, no. So, sometimes families hold together. Sometimes they don't hold together. It can be really quite substantially disparate all over the place. Michael Jordan was 6'6". His brothers weren't. He was the freak. His dad wasn't. He had sons. Neither one of them could play ball a lick. Okay, you couldn't play. All right, so it's like, how the hell is your name Michael Jordan Jr. and you can't frickin' play, and half of that dude's genes are inside of you? The answer is, oh well. Okay, so that's why we could select artificially very hard, but it would take many, 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 many generations to, for example, move the average IQ of 100 to move it to the 75th percentile. That wouldn't happen. Jeffrey Miller's thinking was, oh, it's only if it's a few genes. Holy shit, they're identified and those people mate. They could very quickly, in 2 generations, they could have the entire population, hike itself up by, a standard deviation. And then he said, it's game over for the United States. Mm-hmm. He looked at that and he said, holy shit, you're done. If you have a whole population of people that average 140 IQ, it's game over. Okay. But now we know, oh, it's not even remotely possible. It couldn't happen. So could you do that in 50 generations? Sure. That's 1,000 years from now. If you started that program today, you probably couldn't get that far, but you could probably pick up a standard deviation, i.e., 30 IQ points. I mean, on average. So you could take your you could take your population from an average of 100 to maybe an average of 115. Okay, so you could take it there. In fact, that was done. It was done with the Ashkenazi Jews. Okay, we don't know when that happened, but that has been a sequestered breeding pool for about 3,000 years. We can tell by the mutation loads and the gene variances, et cetera. So we know that those Jewish mothers have really done a good job having their way. By God, those people only breed in the gene pool, and nobody cheats, outside the gene pool. Like, that's what's happened. It's all going to shit now, but the bottom line is it didn't for 3,000 years. So what we don't know is we don't know when there was such tremendous selection pressure. It wasn't survival pressure. It wasn't, quote, that the smart ones, escaped all the tragedies of the last 2 millennia. No, that isn't what happened. What happened is that probably religious persecution kept them out of a lot of activities. And it wound up being that they weren't allowed to be Masons, and they weren't allowed to do this and do that, and so they effectively got sequestered into little what do you call it, little accounting jobs and things of this nature. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just something about this, Nathan?
No, just an in-group. I read a paper on it was trying to explain the evolutionary psychology of anti-Semitism and the opposite. So right. Basically, like in Jewish circles, apparently there's like you said, there's extreme separation between Jewish and not Jewish, and then on the other side too. And just like you said, there's some. And so the paper I was reading, it was saying that it was a response. The anti-Semitism was a response to the in-group out-group behavior of the Semites, of the Jews.
Right.
And so, but I think there's both. It's both sides.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah,
I think that would make sense. In other words, there's all kinds of, you can see a whole bunch of little dynamics that would play out. Mm-hmm. So one of them that would play out would be the hard to get a job, and therefore now you take these jobs that the Gentiles are willing to give you, and it turns out that they're willing to give you these boring bookkeeping jobs. You know what I'm saying? And so you do those bookkeeping jobs. It turns out that those are pretty valuable economically, more so than people would have thought. They would have thought that brandishing a sword was valuable because that looks all more cool, but and it's more sexually attractive to something that came from a hunter-gatherer warrior species. But now it turns out that now you get growing populations, commercial processes, insurance, calculations to be done. Suddenly, the nerdy people start having an advantage. Not that the Jewish folks had any corner on that DNA, but if it turns out that the only ones that can get a job are the ones that can do that stuff, and the ones that get a good job are the ones that you direct your daughter to marry, okay, and that they can actually afford to support more children that can survive. Suddenly, you have a selection pressure on IQ. And so obviously we know for a fact, and it's not true for Sephardics. So in different places in the world, Sephardic is just a Sephardic population has an IQ that is consistent with the rest of the surrounding races, etc. So i.e. nothing special, nothing bad, just right where we would expect humanity. But the Ashkenazis are specifically unusual, and they are very unusual statistically. And so for everybody that's terrified of the IQ superiority deviation, that's not who you should be worried about. So
I was also thinking too, is perhaps is China kind of trying to eliminate the not the gene itself, but say try to direct behavior with the social credit scores, so that people not only with potentially high IQ but also high conscientiousness and kind of ability to cooperate, so they kind of shunt these people so they stay with themselves. It's kind of a eerie thought to think of, but
I think that actually happened over the last thousand years in China. This was Nicholas Wade writing in A Troublesome Inheritance, talking about how China under empire for 1,000 years has absolutely selected and basically rewarded people who are not only very bright but also very, very careful to not display any discord with the regime. And you're probably better off if you're able to not display discord with the regime if you don't feel discord with the regime. So you're slowly over 1,000 years, you go through 50 generations since Genghis Khan, and you're going to wind up with, a population that is going to have characteristics that will have evolved their way around some constraints in the same way that populations evolve their way around all constraints. So in different places of the world, constraints on sunshine change morphology. Constraints on behavior and psychology are going to influence what it is that you see. Obviously, we are not talking about stereotypes here. We're talking about shifts of gene frequencies in populations, and so you're going to see the fact that obviously in all populations you see wide variation between individuals. So you see wide variations in physical and psychological characteristics all over the globe within populations and between continental populations. So, but can you see evidence of effectively selective breeding? And the answer is, yeah, I believe that you can. I don't think there's any doubt about it. You see evidence of, i.e., everybody is practicing eugenics. So you can see that inside the body morphologies. And so, for example, the different kinds of morphological characteristics you see in men and women all over the globe, there isn't one prototype of the species that people find most sexually attractive. We find different prototypes in different places. They have different morphological characteristics for soft tissue, for example. Curvier, less curvy, thinner, taller, stronger, more upper body strength, less upper body, like all kinds of freaking things. In addition to, as I talked about earlier, the difference in facial structure between an Irishman and a Russian. They're different. And you look at those and you're like, well, maybe it's because it was colder in the upper Caucasus Mountains range and they needed the nose that did this. Who the hell knows? I mean, could it have been survival characteristics? Maybe. But a huge argument can be made for what's known as founder effects that give rise to essentially a characteristic that becomes popular in a breeding pool and therefore then guides the evolution of characteristics that are not having survival effects, they're having reproduction effects. Okay, so this is deeply explored by Geoffrey Miller in The Mating Mind. As he explains, he partially explains how some of this could work. There's other factors that could be at play. God knows what this question was. So how are we going to get really smart people? Right. The answer is yes. Yeah. If you were a giant or a dictator that could last for 1,000 years, and you look down over our species, and you could say, okay, kill all those mice, breed these, kill all those mice, breed these, kill all those mice, breed these. Yes. You could go up a standard deviation. We know because that's what's happened to the Jewish people.
Well, it happens.
We could see that it happened. What's that?
It happens in scientific discovery too, when they breed mice specifically to have certain genetic conditions, so they can test those conditions with certain drugs and control trials.
Yes. So, but you're not going to get there. Miller's great fear is that you could as a country you could get there in a generation. You can't. It's impossible. There's no one gene or suite of genes that you can select for that would cause the maybe the most impactful gene. It's a single gene in a constellation of genes that they found with respect to weight variation. Is a single gene is associated with 5 extra pounds of fat. It's like, okay, that's a pretty big deal. That's one gene. But if somebody's 80 pounds overweight, probably they don't have that gene. But if they did, it's only responsible for 5 pounds of the 80 pounds you're seeing. So how are we going to select for everybody to be thin eating junk food? The answer is we're not. So anyway, yeah. So the story is that the questioner is correct in saying, well, wait a second, why couldn't this happen? And the answer is it could, but you would have to have incredible selection pressure on this. There's so many lessons to come out of this that I can act smart now, but I didn't know these things until I read Plumman. So people have been forever worried. The early eugenics movement was terrified that humanity was a cesspool, and that if we didn't give it some harsh direction, it was going to turn into the slop. And it turned out, no, that didn't work out that way, no matter where you looked at it. In other words, and that's because it's because these are such piecemeal processes. I think I think it was Plomin in Blueprint, explained that whoever smart you are now, you should understand that 3 or 4 generations from now, your great grandchildren are probably not going to be anything special. Okay. Now, if you got a bunch of money and were able to sleep up in the world because you were a guy and had a fancy job and you had a pretty wife, your average genes that are out there in the future 4 generations from now may be in little better looking houses than they were in your immediate personal family. Your immediate personal family might have been a bunch of 5s. You married into with the 8s, and then they, however, little by little, that whatever IQ fancy gets diluted, and 4 generations from now, you're back in the soup looking average. And that's, of course, how it is. So the LeBron James genes 100 years from now are going to be nowhere. Okay. So they're going to be average members of the population. And so this is the swirling cauldron of genetic soup. And that's how life works.
Yeah, which is interesting, because if it weren't true, then we would see the kids of the last NBA generation be continuing to play in the NBA for generations and generations, but we have new players constantly. We don't have kids. Yeah.
You'll usually see a few.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So
Like
you get some really
son.
spectacular outliers.
Yeah.
Jordan didn't get anybody that could even play NCAA Division I ball, but but Del Curry had 2 kids that wound up in the NBA. So Steph and I forget the other kid's name. But the point is, Henry Bibby 40 years ago had a son, Mike Bibby, that played. In other words, it happens because these brilliant people have smart kids. It's almost always that the kid isn't as good as his dad. Kobe Bryant, it went the other way. Kobe was actually better than his dad. He might be the only one that where it ever went upside down that way. But the point of it all is that the genes are a swirling cauldron. You're not going to be able to direct them very well. You can't do that now anyway, because you can't control people at that level. And even if you could, the amount of generations that it would take to select on a given characteristic and to cause a big change would be, many, many generations. So it would take, a couple of 100 years to see something really substantial. And so who the hell is going to carry a program through there? By God, if we just aim at 200 years from now, we will our people will be at a big advantage. The total joke.
That idea would die out in generations anyway.
Oh God,
right?
yeah, that idea is going to die instantly. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it may be. I wouldn't put it past some totalitarian, narcissistic dictators to think that they might be able to pull off such a stunt like that. But and to the point where Jeffrey Miller was worried about it, because I think he had information that they were trying to pull off a stunt like that. Mm-hmm. But now we know that, to the best of our knowledge, right now, that such a stunt is impossible. So it is. So there you go. So you could do it, but it's going to take you 1,000 years. Now Hitler thought that his buildings were going to last for 1,000 years. So hey, maybe you start and see what happens. But it's absurd. The whole thing is nothing other than an interesting thought experiment. But it is. But I think we can see now, with our understanding about genes' work, where it goes. Yeah. I can remember talking to a friend of mine about some girl that I was dating, and I liked her, but I just wasn't sure if it made sense. And I was talking about some of her genetic characteristics, which I won't reveal. Okay. And he laughed at me, and he said, "Yeah, you forgot to watch. I have to show you a documentary about Albert and Mileva Einstein." Okay. So Albert was Albert, of course, and then the wife that he bred with. It's useful to know that she was his first wife was his co-op. I mean, she was actually a co-student that he met at some freaking fancy, unbelievable grad student, studenthood in mathematics or physics or whatever the hell it was. And so she like totally worked out stuff with him. She was obviously a utterly world-class elite mathematician. And so anyway, they had 4 kids.
I'm guessing they were duds from an
Oh,
IQ
for
standpoint.
4.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my friend had seen this and he was laughing and it's like, hey, Albert, Albert and Maleva went 0 for 4. You just ought to just try to enjoy yourself and not worry about it is the right strategy. All right. All
Yeah.
right. What else we got?
Well, I mean, it would seem just a last thing is it would seem that there'd be all kinds of interesting incentives for people to not want to agree with this stuff, which is, if they themselves are smart or have characteristics that they feel are very valuable in society, they wouldn't want this stuff to get out, would they? Because then it makes it seem like there's no reason for them to like there's no shiny bow on the gift,
There's these things that's why Nick Wade called it a troublesome inheritance. It's troubling for people to discover that they're constrained by their genetic code. And you are constrained by your genetic code. And it's so obvious that you're constrained by your genetic code, but it also hurts. It effectively, there's an anxiety that it's going to hurt your status because people are going to slot you into a location in a competitive domain according to their analysis of your genetic code. And you're designed by nature to fight and try to rise in hierarchies as high as you can. And there is slop and subjectivity in many of these competitions. Who's a better painter? Michelangelo or Rembrandt? Well, we're going to debate about it, okay? And in theory, some girl is going to be influenced by who says whose is better. Okay, you see how this would work. In other words, so there's going to be a social process by which there may be a preponderance of favor on one variation over another just start arguing about, well, who's the best baseball player of all time? Who's the best basketball player of all time? These guys like to continue to argue about that. Like, and what are we arguing about? Well, who really has the best genes? Who really has the best genes? Who should the female be mating with? The 1985 version of Michael Jordan or the 2000 version of LeBron James? Which is the better choice? Okay. And so the point is that human beings are disturbed if you say, well, actually, I've got a really good blood test here and I can really tell the story. Your kid is a 75th percentile brain. Okay. I.e., when it comes to all the ways that we're going to measure abilities in the brain, it's 75th percentile. Oh, well, how dare you? That can't be true. He can work on it. He can be this and be that. No, he can't. He's not going to be a doctor. He's not going to be a lawyer. He's not going to be an engineer. He's not going to be an Indian chief. This is not going to happen. Okay. Oh, but he could be Rembrandt. Absolutely, he could be Rembrandt. We don't have tests now that can tell the genetic code on artistic ability. Oh, well, I'm James Coyne and I wrote the talent code and art isn't genetic. Oh, yes, it is, Coyne. Okay. The talent code is the story of the development of neural circuitry in the brain by practice by the myelin sheath. Obviously, LeBron James didn't step out there at 18 years old and dominate the NBA without ever having shot a basketball. You have to go through the process of repetition, but you'll find that people's abilities are constrained by their genetics. And you will find that people do not change their shooting percentages from the free throw line from year 1 to year 15 in the NBA. They are incredibly similar. LeBron James has always been a shitty free thrower. Always. He's a 70% free thrower. And the answer is he's a big, strong moose, and he only has so much control over the fine motor coordination that's involved. So when he misses, he doesn't miss the side to side because he's got good technique, but he misses long and short. Okay, Michael Jordan was an 84% free throw shooter, outstanding, triangulating on about as good as human beings get. Big difference, okay? Huge difference. 15% difference in a skill like that, that's noticeable. one guy, they shoot 15 free throws a game. One guy's hitting 10, one guy's hitting 13. It's a hell of a difference. And so people notice those differences, and those are genetic. So the point is that I forget where I'm going to. There is absolutely slop in presentation that will take place as a result of what it is that you've learned, without a doubt. Okay. And people know that, hey, if I push my kid, or if my kid pushes, he can rise. Right. He's going to rise, but he will hit a constraint. He or she, they will hit constraints. Okay. So it all depends upon how competitive the domain is. A really good idea is to keep inventing some new sport that nobody's done before. Like I'll just have a new sport like Gershfeld. I decided, can I keep it from going? I'll bet I can do that better than Michael Jordan. If I practice for long enough, can I balance the thing on my head? Can I do it better than Michael Jordan? Well, if I work hard enough, I can.
Yeah.
All right. But the point is that I will hit the genetic constraint. And then, Nadia Comaneci can do it better than me because she can hold her head steadier than I can hold my head. So if it gets popular enough, what happens is what people can learn will converge on optimum relative to what their genetic constraints are. And so when it comes to, for example, how well somebody's going to do in an economy generally, we can take a look at the kid, do the blood test, 75th percentile brain in math and what do you call it, verbal capabilities. We can also do a little personality test, say hi to him, watch him on the playground with the other kids, set up something where he gets to call against him and see how he handles it. We can do a pretty good personality test to tell how he's going to be socially. And then we can basically say that kid is going to be somewhere between the 65th and 85th percentile when it comes to income when he's 30 years old. And our odds of being right are really high. Okay. Now, might he have done something spectacular in a new field and where there wasn't competition and gotten rich? Sure, of course, it's possible. He joined a startup and he was one of the first people that was in there, and he's the guy that swept the floor, and it turned out it was Apple Computer, and now he's a billionaire. Possible. Okay. But if we're actually talking about what we would likely to see happen, it's going to happen within constraints. That fact is not comfortable for human beings. Okay. People don't like that. They're like, no, I don't want to hear any constraints on, don't have anybody tell you what you can and can't do. Well,
they want to be able to bluff if they want to.
What's that?
Are they wanting to bluff if they need to in certain situations?
Yeah, they're bluffing. They're wanting to not get discounted and slotted early. You know what I'm saying? Basically, we want a society, a free enterprise society, where you get to waste your time and energy pursuing anything you want as long as you can feed yourself or somebody will feed you. Mm-hmm. So, i.e., the kid that thinks he's going to be the next Howard Hughes or the next what do you call it, Robert Redford or Brad Pitt. I'm going to be an actor. I'm going to be an actor. Well, as long as you got a grandma there that's willing to finance you, for the next 30 years, you can keep trying. You won't have any success because I don't know. You look like Danny DeVito. You're not going to be Brad Pitt. So the point is that I wouldn't want to, basically dictate to somebody their limitations, but it would be absurd for us and for them to ignore them. Okay. And so, but we have a society with an ideology that there are quite a few ideologies. Fundamentally, Marxist ideology is terrified and absolutely vehemently opposed to the idea that there are individual differences in human talent, ability, intelligence, looks, everything else. Sexual attractiveness. The idea is that, oh, no, they're all the same. They're all cookie cutters. Oh, it's a blank slate. No, it's all about the culture. That's what does it to you. That's what's beautiful. You start to see the absurdity of where this winds up going in a lot of ideology. It's like, oh no, there's no universal beauty. It's what Hollywood or Madison Avenue said it was, like hell. Okay. All you have to do is go back and look at Greek statues. They look like the most attractive people in your society today that are celebrated for their looks. That's exactly what they look like. Okay, so the point is, though, we can see the frustration and anxiety and anger and defensiveness. You're looking at people trying to do everything they can to defend their own upside. and i.e., including the upside of their offspring. And so they like to hear words like, they could be anything. Your kid could be anything. They don't want to hear words like, oh no, your kid can absolutely. There's a whole shitload of things like your kid can ever do. I mean, but to not be willing to face that is kind of absurd. It's a waste of time and energy. It's a ego trapping nightmare for the kids themselves. It's a bunch of bullshit. Okay. The truth of the matter is that anybody that is going to be the coach of a serious athletic team knows, hey, you pick talent and ability and conscientiousness for hard work because you know that there's some upside in what they could do. It's simple. Same thing if you're running a company. You don't look at them like a bunch of cookie cutters. You look at them as individual human beings with individual abilities and individual levels of motivation. Okay? Of course. That's how we pick our mates. That's how we pick our friends. That's how we pick everything. That's how nature picks the resource acquisition and defense decisions of all animals. Okay? So yes, these are uncomfortable realities. And it turns out that human beings have now discovered enough about the nature of what makes us who we are that it's literally down into the genetic code. It's down into nucleotide pairs. It's like, holy smokes, how deterministic can it get? Okay, and the answer is pretty freaking deterministic. Okay, you're not going to have a human being that can jump higher than 52 inches off the ground. It's not going to happen. I think there's one guy in the world. Michael Jordan could jump 48 in his prime. Okay, so i.e. there's a constraint that a flea can jump higher. So these are genetics that are determining the physical and psychological architecture of plants and animals. Okay, they have a tree with a lot of will. Can it stand up to the fire? Depends on how thick its bark is. Depends on how hot the fire is. Depends on how long the fire burns. It depends upon how much water was in the ground at the time and how wet it was. Depends on if there's, it depends. But the point is, at the end of the day, it's physics. Okay. At the end of the day, human behavior follows the laws of physics. It has to. And the laws of physics determine the nature of chemistry, that determine the genetic code, that determines the physical and psychological architecture of the animal that we call a human. None of that can violate the laws of physics. You're not going to be able to understand a feeling of love with respect to physics. You could actually chain it in there and see how it worked. But it took billions of years to develop those feelings, to develop nervous systems and a neural architecture, neurotransmitters, reactions. They can build a computer that can have artificial preferences built into it and tell it, what it should go towards and what it shouldn't go towards, what is a resource and what isn't a resource. But they will never build a machine that feels. Okay? That is not possible. So when you look at that and the design that goes down into that goes down into the nuances of subatomic physics and cellular biology. That is where you're going to wind up, literally valence electrons and how they interact and what might remain stable, and then how the cell function works and all this. And then you're going to coordinate 1 trillion cells into a thing called an animal. And then those are going to interact with each other, and they're going to be highly sensitive to environmental variances. All why? So that you can sustain cell biology. So to think that you're going to build a machine like that feels impossible. So anybody that has delusions about that, the machines may take over the world, but it'll be a human that programs their actions with specific goals in mind. Okay, so the machines won't spontaneously start feeling and then wanting to do anything. No, impossible. So anybody that thinks that is, no matter how smart they are utterly naive into the complexity of what it takes to build a single cell. So when we talk about reaching singularity with AI at some bizarre place in the near future, understand that they are not going to be able to build a single cell. We're going to let AI just go right ahead, and we'll find out. Let's see if in the next decade, or by the time I'm dead, whether they have constructed a cell. Okay, I will bet you that they have not. So anyway, this is a long story about the intense complexity of life, nature, intelligence, human psychology, all the things that go into it. It's interesting as we back up at a macro level, and we could see differences between people, between man and woman. We could see differences in individuals that can be striking. We could see differences in people of continental origin, and we could see differences in sometimes remarkable differences physically and psychologically in some cases. This is all interesting, and but at the end of the day, you're not going to shift anything by any program. One more question, just for fun.
All right, that's it for this episode. Really appreciate everyone who watches, shares, comments, likes, and subscribes to our channel. Once again, if you have questions you'd like me to ask Dr. Lisle, you can send it in through the website or email me directly. Part 2 will be coming out shortly. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.